Adding a custom button to portfolio items like these ones here is fairly simple and can be done with pure CSS. With this approach, all values need to be set manually, but I'm going to show you 2 ways to do it so that you can either create a brand new button style or mimic a button style that already exists in your Squarespace project like this one. So let's go ahead and get started. This customization is going to work for both the overlay and the simple portfolio layouts. Now I'm going to work with the overlay one, and I'm actually going to set this to before hover, just because this is going to let me see the button without actually having to place the cursor over the item. So I'm going to set this here, and I'm just going to save the changes. To create the button, we'll be using a pseudo element. Now, the pseudo element needs to be attached to something that already exists on the site. So let's check inside our inspector tool to see what we can use as our anchor based on where we want the button to show. So here, I'm going to go ahead and inspect this, and I'm going to look for that title container there. So here I can see that I directly landed on it, very lucky. And then here you can see that this element here is an H3. Now I want my button to display right below this H3. So I pretty much just want to have it here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to target the container that is holding my H3, and I'm going to attach the pseudo element to this. To set up the selector for this, I'm going to be using the class of portfolio text because that's pretty much the only class that I see that this element has. So I'm going to grab this and I'm going to add it inside my custom CSS window. Now, if you want to make this customization apply to just one kind of portfolio layout, so for example, the overlay one, you will need to look for one of its corresponding classes to narrow down your code. So here you can see that if I go back into the previous element that I just grabbed, the portfolio text, and then I look a little bit higher up at all of the different pairing containers, I'm going to see this one that has a class of portfolio grid overlay. You can use that class or the equivalent for the simple layout to make sure your button only shows up on the type of layout that you want. In my case, I don't want to narrow things down, but I'm going to be including this ID of grid thumbs that applies to any of the portfolio layout so that you can swap it for something else if you need to narrow things down. Now, of course, instead of a class, if you don't want to work with the overlay or the grid specifically, but you want to work with a particular page, then you can go ahead and replace this ID with the page ID or a data section ID. Okay, so now that we're clear on where we want to implement this, let's go ahead and create our pseudo element. I want the button to show up below my title or after my title. So I'm going to go ahead and create an after pseudo element just because this is going to simplify its placement. Next, we actually need to bring the pseudo element to life by giving it some content. So here, because I actually want this to hold content inside it, I don't want it to be an empty container, I'm going to go ahead and type in whatever it is that I want to display on my button. So I'm going to type in here, C project. So once I have that in there, you're going to see that now that text shows up underneath the titles of each of the different portfolio items. And basically the next step is just to style this however we want. So let's go ahead and get started with the background color. So background color, and I'm going to be using a little hex code that I have here on the side. So that's 3D4435, which is basically the dark green that I have on the site. Next, I'm going to go ahead and set up the color of the font. So I'm going to set that to white. I'm going to make sure that my button is set to display block, so that I can then add a little bit of padding to it. So here I'm going to be using 1 EM, 2 EMs. All right, so now in terms of font size, let's set this up as 0.9 rem. The font weight is going to be bold. I want this to be full uppercase, so I'm gonna set here text transform uppercase. And let's go ahead and give it a little bit of space in between the title and the button. So I'm going to be using margin at the top 10 pixels for that. Okay, perfect. Now, one last thing, I don't want the button to expand as much as it's doing right now. So considering the fact that the portfolio text is currently a flexbox item, I'm going to go ahead and retarget that up here. Then I'm going to give it an align items value of center. All right, so this is pretty much the final result that you get when you create your button this way with very specific values applied to each of the different properties that you want to use. But what happens if what you want to do is recreate an existing style that's already on the site? Well, in that case, you pretty much have two routes. The first route is to look at the exact values that those buttons are using and then implement them here in the code, just like we did before. But the second route is to use variables instead of the values so that if you change something in the site styles, that also changes in your new custom button. Now, I know that you may already be aware or have even used Squarespace variables or custom properties before, but if you haven't, I'm going to show you how to use them. If you're interested in learning how they work and how you can even create your own, let me know in the comments below. But for the sake of time, I'm just going to show you how to use the one that Squarespace applies to buttons inside our new button. The first thing you need to do is inspect the type of button that you want to use. So in my case, I want to mimic the secondary button look. So that's the one that I'm going to be inspecting. I'm going to go ahead and open up here my inspect element tool. And then I can see that I just landed directly on that A element, which is the part of the button that is actually carrying the styles. So now on the right side, if I were to look through all of the code that I have here, I can see that there are a couple of different properties that have this sort of blue link applied to them as the value. Those are the custom variables that we'll be reusing in our code. These are pretty much linked to styles that are inside our site styles. So when the value changes inside the panel, the value changes in the code. To use them, we can pretty much just copy and paste that variable inside the corresponding property in our code. So here, if I were to use the same font family that the secondary button has, I'm just going to copy the whole variable, including the little var prefix here at the front, and I'm going to add my font family here. Font family, and I'm just going to reuse that variable. Now, there's not much of a difference at the moment because the same font family was inherited before. So let's go ahead and take a look at another example. Let's say that we want to mimic the same font weight. So here you can see that the font weight is set to 400. If you step over the variable, you're going to see the corresponding value applied to it. So this 400 here. And the one that I'm using in the code right now is set to bold. So if I were to replace this, you're going to see that now I have a 400 font weight applied to the button instead of the bold one. Let's see something else. So here, if I want to mimic the same text transform, which right now is set to none, if I copy this and replace my uppercase, now I don't have a text transform applied. There are a few instances where you do have to manually add in the value that appears inside the inspect element tool. Like for example, with the border radius, or in the case of outline buttons, the background color. So let's go ahead and take a look at that. Here, if I kept looking at my secondary button and then go all the way down here, I'm going to see that here I have a variable for the color. So this is the color as a font, so I can grab that. And then for the background color, you're going to see that there's not really a variable here. So just looking at the different properties, we have font size, font family, all of these ones that we already saw. We have a background property, but this one doesn't really have a custom property applied to it or a variable applied to it. And then if I open this up, you can see how the background color is pretty much set here to initial. So it has, let's call it a fixed value. It's not really a variable value like it would be with a variable. So in that case, we would need to manually set it up here. So here, if I were to use the color variable, you can see how the font color changes, but then I need to manually add in the background color. So here I could set it to white, I could set it to transparent too if I wanted to. Another example of this is the border radius. So I don't know if you noticed, but here, the border radius is set to 100%. The value is not located within a variable. So in this case, I would need to go in, type in my border radius property, and then add in the fixed value that Squarespace is using. There is a plugin inside the snippet directory that pulls in this info too. You pretty much just have to type in the name of the button you want to replicate, and even the hover mode is implemented immediately. In any case, once you have your variables set, regardless of if they're mixed or not, If you were to go into the site styles and then change something about those specific buttons, so let's go with color here. This is lightest one, both of them are lightest one. So if I were to change, let's say, the color of the font, which I think is going to be the most obvious one. Here, secondary button background, I actually think it's this one that they use for the text. There we go. So you can see that if I alter that color for the font here, that also changes inside my custom button. So this is a very flexible and user-friendly way for you to be able to set up these elements, because if your client decides to change something about them, the style is going to apply here as well, and you're not going to have to go back into the code to make the modification yourself. So there you have it. Now you know how to create and style your portfolio custom buttons on your client site. If you have any questions or comments, leave them down below. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.